One day, just maybe talk about our attendance rules. Committee met on Tuesday this past week. Got looking at our attendance figures. Seems to be down a little. So we got looking at some of the roles. I looked at our class last week, and they had us counted as 15 being here last week.
That's about half.
I knew there was more than 15 here, so I got to looking at the roll. And I came up immediately with 10 people that I knew were here that was not checked off. I think what happened last week, I don't think it ever got over on this side of the room. So we'll start it this morning. I've already checked off Bob and Billy and Gail and Bill. So we'll start it on the second row. And when it gets back there, James, when it gets back to you, be sure it gets back over to this side. Okay?
Thank you, Greg. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome back to Genesis. We are, I'm going to say just a few things about the end of last week to clarify some things. And then we're going to pick up toward the end of chapter 9 and hopefully get through 15. We'll see. That's the goal. In case we don't get to the last slide, next week the reading is 16 through 19. So if you're reading ahead, that's what you need to read for next week. And I'm going to leave the mask off. I'll try to socially distance myself from these guys, just in case. And most of you probably know Lauren has COVID, so we've been kind of dealing with that all week. She's better. Her cough's gone. She's through her antivirals. And so, and I tested negative and haven't had any symptoms. I think I'm fine, but just as an abundance of caution, I wore masks. So last week, I think it was Gail that asked about that word Timshel that Steinbeck used in his book East of Eden, and she was asking where that is. That's actually in chapter 4, verses 7, where God is talking to Cain, and he says, you know, if you do right, will you not be accepted? Sin is crouching at your door, but you should rule over it. So that Timshel, it's actually Timshal in Hebrew, so Steinbeck was a great Hebrew scholar, but at least he got the idea. And then in the movie, I think, of East of Eden, he calls it thou mayest. In other words, we have the choice. Are we going to submit to sin when it's crouching at the door, or are we going to rule over it as we should, as God intended for us to do? So there's one clarification. The other one is at the end of last week, we got through the flood, and I was mentioning at the very end there, I got kind of in a hurry, I think I scrambled some things. So just to clarify, I mentioned that there are other flood stories besides the one in the Bible. There are several, actually, Mesopotamian, Sumerian flood stories. And I think I mentioned probably the most popular, one of the most well-known ones is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the 11th tablet of that in the cuneiform is the story of a flood. And I think I said that Gilgamesh was the third king of Uruk. He was actually the king of Uruk in the third dynasty of Ur. So a little difference there. I'm sure you caught that, right? Just to make sure we're square there. Come on in, Brother Moore.
I'm looking for Steve Foster.
Steve Foster, he's been around.
There he is. He's a
Principal called me. Okay, gotta go.
So Gilgamesh was king of Uruk. I don't know which one he was, but it wasn't the third dynasty of Ur. And the flood, I think I may have left the impression that he was the flood hero. He was not the flood hero. He was the king. The flood hero was a guy named Utnapishtim. Was his name. Yeah, crazy name. God's head. But what's really funny is if you contrast, our flood story in the Bible with the other Mediterranean flood stories, they start bad and end bad. Ours starts bad but ends really good, right? With Noah coming through the flood and repopulating the earth. And in fact, I think the reason, in Gilgamesh, the reason why the flood happened was because the humans were being too noisy and keeping the gods up at night. And so they sent the flood and shut them up so they could sleep. So, that's kind of what the flood story in Gilgamesh is all about. So today, we're going to pick up we do this right. With Noah and Ham at the end of the flood, and this is just kind of an interesting little story. I'm not going to read the text here. In fact, I'm not going to read most of the text today because I think y'all are familiar with most of these stories. But after the flood, as you recall, Noah becomes a vine dresser, I guess you can call him. He learns how to grow grapes, and he also learns how to make wine. And he also gets himself pretty drunk drinking his wine. So we have this episode where Noah is drunk and naked in his tent, and his son Ham sees him and goes and tells his brothers. So, interesting thing about that, we don't really know what transpired exactly between Ham and Noah, but Ham's son Canaan winds up getting cursed because of this little incident. At the very least, when the text says that he saw and told, that would be a dishonoring of his father, to go to first to see him in his nakedness, and then to go tell his brothers. So at the very least, he dishonored his father. Another little interesting part of this is that the words "see the nakedness of," like "see the nakedness of his father," that's a Hebrew idiom for having sex. So it may have been something else going on there. It's not really clear in the text, but it's somewhere between those two bounds of what happened between Ham and Noah. So you might think it curious that Noah really isn't judged over. There's not a word said about Noah being drunk, Noah being naked, none of this. And yet Ham's son is cursed over it. It's kind of curious. You'd think it would be Noah, right? He was the one that wrong here originally. So we have to think about that just a little bit. Here they are kind of carrying him away. The other two boys backed up and put the robe over him so that they could cover him up and everything. And so why do you think it is that Canaan was cursed instead of Ham? Ham was the one that did this, right?
Well, Ham was the father of Canaan. It says here. Ham was the father of Canaan.
Right, but Ham didn't get cursed. Canaan got cursed.
His descendant. Right?
Canaan. So why did Ham was the one that did it? Why didn't Ham get cursed?
His descendants from her.
If you go a little further back in that genealogy there, Ham has already been blessed by Noah. So you can't bless somebody and then come back under the curse and after you bless them, right? So it winds up being, and it's also that principle about sin going down through the generations, right? So it goes down through Canaan's family line. Switch glasses here. Read my notes. So Canaan winds up getting cursed. And then we have that Noah lived a total of 450 years, which basically is 300 years after the flood. So Noah continues to live for quite some time after this, enjoying his vineyard and his wine. What's that?
We don't really know why Canaan was cursed, or what his sin was.
We don't know about what?
Canaan, why? What his sin was.
Well, he's kind of inheriting the sin of Ham, if you will. He's being cursed because of what Ham did.
One of the commentators I read on that speculated that his sin was a sexual sin in nature.
Yeah. Well, that's what that phrase "saw his father's nakedness." That is a Hebrew idiom for having sex with someone. So that could be what happened.
Well,
it's not clear in the text.
In that last painting, but when there was that painting, Ham is mocking his father So, that artist thought that was what was going on.
Right, and that's the dishonoring part. The fact that he saw him and then he went and told his brothers, that's kind of the dishonoring part.
Richard,
Yes.
what I find is interesting is the first time after Adam and Eve transgressed against God,
Uh-huh.
immediately they said they were naked.
Uh-huh.
But it doesn't mean the same thing as Ham and Noah saying naked there,
Not
does
the
it?
same word? Is it the same word?
I did not look it up, so I'm not sure. I can look it up for you.
Because that was their first reaction. We hid because
It's
we were
probably the
naked.
same word, but I'll make a note to look for that next week. See, I remember with them, it was that word that's kind of like the serpent word.
In Jewish tradition, I read a long time ago, that it was very, very humiliating
Mhm.
for a Jew, and these of course are the ancestors of the Jews, but that it was in their tradition and their way of thinking was very, very humiliating to not be
Clothes.
covered.
Right.
And so you look back at Jesus, you look at Jesus, and that's another part of his humiliation that
On
we
the
don't
cross,
talk
yeah.
about, was that he was basically stripped naked.
Right.
And that was so humiliating
That's right.
for him. So it was a psychological and emotional trauma for him.
As well as physical. Okay, so after this little story of Noah and Ham in chapter 10, we have what's referred to as the Table of Nations. And this is starting to tell us kind of like how world population developed after the flood. And so we have these three groups of people depicted here. You can see that the Semites, the descendants of Shem, are kind of in the middle. They are occupying the land that will become the land of Israel. Will become Israel. Or it's Canaan now, but it will become Israel. The descendants of Ham are over in Africa, like in Egypt, and then going down. And then the sons of Japheth are a little bit northern from the people of Shem, and are probably came from a little bit west of there. So you kind of have these three distinct geographies. You also have three distinct groups of people. The people of Shem, the Semites, are more pastoral nomads. They raised sheep and goats and walked around. They lived in tents. They didn't live in cities. They weren't urban people at all. The people of Ham were more urban. Maybe, I'm not sure which cities in Egypt were in play at this point in time. This is pretty early. This is somewhere between 1500 and 2000 BC. But they seem to be more urban dwellers. And then the ones from Japheth are described as seafarers. In other words, they may have come, some of them from the west, and some of these islands that you see here on the map, Javan is Ionia, which is basically Greece, Elisha is Crete, and Kittim is Cyprus. So these are probably the people that wound up being the Philistines later on, as they kind of populate that western coast where Gaza and Tyre and Sidon and all of that are. And so at this point now, we have in the genealogy all the way back from Adam, or Adam, all the way up through the end here, are 70 people, not counting Nimrod. We're going to talk about Nimrod here in a minute. So any questions about that? Just kind of showing you how things spread out. Okay, so Nimrod was according to the Bible, a big guy in Mesopotamia. He built several cities. He built Babylon, Uruk, Akkad in the north, and Nineveh, further up in Assyria. There isn't really a historical record of a guy named Nimrod. So most people think that the Hebrews used Nimrod as a Hebrew name to refer to someone else. And the two leading candidates are this guy Ninurta. His full name is Tukuli Ninurta I. He was an Assyrian conqueror of Babylon. This is about the It's about the 13th century BC. I think that's a little late for this. I guess it could be, but it's a little bit late. The other person who is often identified with Nimrod is Sargon the Great over here, Sargon of Akkad. And we do know historically that Sargon built several of the cities in Mesopotamia. We know that his son Naram-Sin also continued that kingdom on. And so this may be who the writer is referring to here when he talks about Nimrod, the mighty warrior. We just really don't know for sure exactly who he is. So before we go to the Tower of Babel in the next chapter, I want to point out one thing. Normally, when you and I read books, we expect them to start in the beginning and move to the end, and everything is in chronological order, right? That's kind of our expectation because that's how our books are. But their books, including the Bible, are not necessarily like that. There's generally a linear flow to it, but this is one example where it's not linear. For example, when we get to chapter 11, is it 11? The Tower of Babel? Yeah, chapter 11. They all had one language, right? But back over in chapter 10, at the end of the, at verse 31, at the end of the genealogy that's listed there, it says, these are the sons of Shem by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. So they already had different languages in chapter 10, but in chapter 11, they only have one language. So, 11, obviously, the incident with the Tower of Babel occurred prior to this listing of the peoples in chapter 10. And the other thing I think is interesting about this is a little bit of speculation on my part, but I just think it's interesting that in 1025, it talks about Eber. Eber is one of the sons of Shem down the line. That's where the word Hebrew comes from, Eber or Ibri in their language. And it tells us that Eber had two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan, or Joktan. That word for divided, that's a little weak. That's what I have in the ESV. What it really means is split apart. So what he's saying is that in the days of Peleg means split apart. In the days of Peleg, the world, the earth was split apart. Which, kind of makes me think if Babel occurred before this, then he's already confused their languages. This may be when Pangea broke up and Australia went down here and North America came over here. All the Arctic went up there and Antarctica went down there. That may be when that happened. I don't know. That's a little bit of speculation on my part.
Richard.
But it fits. It fits with the story. Yes.
I've got a book that talks about the world that perished.
Uh-huh.
And I forget who it was written by, but it came out of the library, and they pulled a lot of the books out, and I've got that, and I've had it for some time. And it speaks of the world that's been split and all that stuff. So,
I mean, you can look now, if you just look at a map now or globe, you can see the outlines of the continents and how they fit back together like a puzzle. I mean, so it's pretty clear that's probably what happened, which really, again, as I said last week, people think, well, how can there be a flood that would cover all these different countries? Well, it probably was just one landmass, and there weren't that many people, right? 25 to 30 million people.
Well,
So
you could say united.
What's that?
United.
United?
After they were divided, they come back, were united of one language, one speech.
So they were, at Babel, they had one language and one speech. That's where they were going to get to that in a second year.
Yeah, okay.
But that's where they were confused, and then I think this probably happened after that, because clearly in the listing in 10, they already have different languages, the different families, so it has to be after Babel, because they already have different languages instead of one language. Okay, so that's just an aside, again, a little bit of speculation on my part.
Richard.
Yeah.
One other thing before you leave now. It's interesting that Canaan, they settled over all that territory of what is now Israel.
Right. Really, even more.
Yeah, even more.
Yeah.
And they were there when the Israelites came back years later.
Yep.
To take the land.
That's right. That's
So
right.
that was the land of Canaan.
Yeah, all those tribes, Girgashites, Jebusites, Amalekites, they're all that people from Canaan. That's exactly right. Okay, so in 11, we have the story of the Tower of Babel. And again, I think you're familiar with this. I'm not going to read it all, but we see several things here. The people are, they decide that they're going to build this tower to go up into the heavens. And this is a part excavation, part reconstruction of a ziggurat in Babylon, which actually could be the tower. I mean, it's technically able to actually be the Tower of Babel, but we don't know that for sure, obviously. But what was the problem, do you think, with them building this tower? There's a few problems with this, which is why I got confused. Yep.
They gave God no glory for where they were at.
Okay, yeah, it's all about them, right?
Yes.
Okay, anything else?
You know, didn't they not know that about Noah in his story? And then they go off to build this tower.
They should have. Wasn't that long ago, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't that long ago at all. So, you know, if you think about what God told them to do, God told them to, you know, multiply, fill the earth. You know, they're kind of wanting to stay in one place. They don't want to be scattered, which is exactly what they got. They got scattered. But that's not what they wanted. They have a lot of pride there in that. And it just shows you kind of how what they're doing is directly against what God has told them that he wants them to do. And so this is kind of, we have a turning point here, more or less, from the spread of sin, which occurred up to the flood, until now, as they're kind of vanished, the spread of grace for the rest of the story. And we'll get to Abraham in a second. And again, I said last week, we go through creation in the first couple of chapters, uncreation after the fall of the transgression, and then now recreation after the flood.
Richard, could I say something else, please?
Sure.
I'm just thinking about the technology that we have today and what we've been able to do today with technology. We've been to the moon and
Oh yeah.
and you know, and we've been.
Why do you stop that?
And we've already sent satellites that are taking pictures of the, whatever you want to call it, you know, of Mars and farther out than that. I mean,
Yeah.
And they just recently built a satellite that was going to go millions and billions out into the space. So.
He's being a lot more patient with us now than he was.
Well,
back
that's
then,
the
right?
thing about it. He's, you know, of course, I mean, we have the two covenants, and he changed the old covenant, and we picked up the new covenant through Jesus Christ, you know. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, it is.
it's
a little bit
amazing
different.
the difference in what the new era of the technology and the testament we have and what we possess and what we can do than what we were doing in the Old Testament, you know.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, these are just some more artist renditions of what these things might have looked like. This one on the left is a little aberrant. Usually they're stepped. The cigarettes are stepped. The one on the right is maybe a little bit more accurate. But it's interesting that, again, these are drawings, artist renditions, where the other one was an actual photograph of what's in Babylon. If you'll recall, Babylon was the home of Marduk. He was their god in Babylon. And he had a temple called Esagil in Babylon, and that temple meant, the word Esagil meant house of the uplifted hand. Now, next to the temple, there was a ziggurat, which may have been that one that we looked at. We don't know, but there was a ziggurat next to it that was called Intiminaki. I hate these Sumerian names. And that meant house of the foundation of heaven and earth, which sounds an awful lot like Babel, doesn't it? So we don't know. That might have been what this is all referring to. Attempted to avoid. Okay. So the other thing here that's kind of important is the play on words. There's another couple of artist renditions. Babil, B-A-B-I-L, is what they called it, the people in Babylonia called it, which means basically gate of God. And it's actually been thought that, later on when we see Jacob having a dream about the ladder that goes, he may have actually been dreaming about a ziggurat that he had seen, that had, steps going up and coming down from heaven. But the Hebrew is kind of fun here. It's one of those fun things where they were calling it Babel, but the writer uses the word Balal, 2 L's, 1 B, instead of 2 B's and 1 L. And Balal means confused. So he's calling it that. The dollar using that Balal word to note that that's where the languages were confused and brought about all this change in the earth. So another one of those little Hebrew pun things. It's kind of fun. And that's going to bring us to Abraham. And we're going to spend the rest of the time this morning talking about him. I think, we're doing good on time. We might actually get to 15. Any questions about any of that before we launch into Abraham? Okie doke. So, this just depicts a lot of Abraham's journey. And I want to point out, too, if you recall, when we talked in the beginning about the structure of the book, there's 2 structural divisions, right? We've got the macro structure is like chapters 1 through 11, which is primeval histories, and then 12 through the rest of the book is patriarchal narratives. Well, we're there. We're about to leave this half and get into this half. But the other structure that we have are those passages that have the word toledot in them that mean generations. And so the first one was in 2:6. He said, these are the generations of heaven and the earth. Then we have the generations of Adam. And then we have the generations of Noah and the sons and so forth. And actually, we just said on the last few slides, when we had Noah's sons genealogy, that's the 4th toledot. So we're running through these things. The first 5 or 6 are really short, and then the others are really long because it's going to take up the rest of the book. There's only 10 total. So just wanted to keep that structure in mind as we go forward. And we'll look a little bit more here at Abraham. So interesting parallels between Adam, our first man, and Abraham, our father of faith, Abram, as he's called here. Abram means exalted father, which I think is really interesting that they named him exalted father when he was childless. Kind of a paradox, right? But later, his name gets changed to Abraham, which is father of multitudes or father of many nations. So he does become an exalted father. I guess it was a little bit prophetic there. But the primary location for Adam, of course, is in the Garden of Eden. The primary location for Abram is in the land of Canaan. That's the land that God's going to give him. Adam is told to be fruitful and multiply. Abram is told, you're going to have lots of kids. You're going to have tons of kids. God walked with Adam in the garden before the fall. And Abram is also described as walking before God in chapter 17. So we'll see that as well. And the progress is different. Adam progresses from a state of being in relationship with God to a state of curse, where he's driven out of the garden, whereas Abram moves from basically being a pagan. If you read Joshua 24, Terah, his father, and Abram, and all the brothers, and Lot, they all lived in Ur and worshiped other gods. They didn't worship Yahweh in Ur. And so they were pagans, but they moved toward not only being blessed, but being a meaning of blessing to others. In fact, we're blessed today because of Abraham. And so there's also some, I'll move that slide, so we'll go to this next one. Yeah, so this is kind of the family tree, if you will. So we have Terah there at the top, and we have the sons of Terah, Haran, Nahor, and Abram. think Haran is the one that had died. And then Abram, of course, has first his slave girl Hagar, which we'll get to next week, and then later Sarah. Or maybe they're at the same time, but he has the child with Hagar and then the child with Sarah. So it's interesting that the three sons, Haran, Nahor, and Abram, are kind of parallel to the Shem, Ham, and Japheth from Noah. So we kind of see these patterns that occur over and over here. And one of the points I think that as we go through this transition from primeval, so you say it, primeval history into ancestral narratives, is that the author is linking the God of creation and the God of Israel. Their God of Israel, the nation as it comes about, is the same God that created the heavens and the earth. He's tying those two things together through this motif of the two different parts there. That's kind of in the side. So Abram winds up, it's kind of interesting how, again, the symmetry here. There are 10 generations from Adam to Noah, 10 generations from Shem to Abram. Exactly. Abram is the seventh from Eber, who is supposed to be the first Hebrew, believe that. And 20 generations after Adam. Okay, so, everybody good? Any questions? All right, so now then we're going to pick it up in chapter 12. We're now officially in the second half of the book. Okay? And so in chapter 12, we have the call of Abram. And I mean, if you think about this, this is just really interesting. Terah, Abram and the brothers are over there in Ur of the Chaldees, pagans, worshiping other gods. For some reason that we don't know, they moved to Haran, over here, east. And their intent, we're told later, was to go to Canaan, but for some reason, they stopped in Haran and stayed there for quite some time. And then later, God comes to Abram and says, okay, Abram, I got someplace I want you to go. Yeah, you're going south down into Canaan, to where all these foreigners live, right? And he tells him he wants to give up three things. You're going to leave your country, you're going to leave your people, and you're going to leave your father's house. Terah did not go to Canaan. He stayed. In fact, he lived in Canaan. I mean, he lived in Haran a long time after Abram left. So, now, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation before where, you know, you said, I'm going to go somewhere, but I don't know where I'm going, right? I'm just going to go. Yeah, I can't quite imagine. I wonder how Lot and Sarah took that. Lot, you know, he might have said, hey, this is an adventure, let's go, you know. I got a feeling Sarah wasn't too cool with this idea of, let's just pick up and move south, we don't know where we're going. Can you ladies be comfortable with that? You're just going to decide to go somewhere, but we don't know where we're going? That's a lot of faith, it really is. And the thing that's amazing to me about Abraham is he's so simple in his thinking and his theology, but he's so faithful. It's just a simple faith that is profound. It really is, when you think about it. He will just pick up and go, not knowing where he's going, because God sent him. I mean, that's really profound. Would we be so faithful today, right?
That's the key.
Yeah.
Yahweh told him to go.
Yeah, that is the key.
It's not like my husband said I should go here.
Right.
Or I don't know where we're going.
But you got to wonder what Sarah had to say about it, right?
God is the one that told him, and he had the faith in God.
Also, when he's told to go, he's not just, random go. He said, you're going to be blessed. And there are three blessings that he's promised there in the early part of chapter 12. The promise of land, the promise of descendants, and that not only will he be blessed, but that he will be a blessing to other people. So there's some motivation, the blessings that are promised to him. But it's interesting that one of the commentators I read made a point I thought was really good, that how often faith is demonstrated by separation. And he's leaving his family, he's leaving Terah behind in Haran and going someplace where he didn't know where he's going. But that is his faith in action, if you will. So he's really putting his money where his mouth is when he says he has faith in Yahweh. There's also often a gap between promise and fulfillment, as we'll see. This whole thing takes quite a while to play out. Okay, so here's the outline of his journey. He goes south. First, he stops there kind of between Bethel and Ai at Shechem. Then he goes a little bit further south, ultimately going all the way down to Egypt when there's a famine, and then coming back into the land of Canaan afterwards. So I think one of the most profound verses in here is 12:4, where it just says, "So Adam went." So Abram went. He just went. It was that simple. He did what God told him to do. It was a radical dependence upon God that was demonstrated there. Because he didn't know where he's going, he didn't know what's going to happen. But he went. He did what he was supposed to do. A lot of ways, 11:10, some of this kind of foreshadows the Exodus.
I might be wrong about this, but
Yeah.
then Lot was his cousin, right?
Lot was his nephew,
Never his nephew.
his brother's son.
Okay, but then Abraham, did he give a Lot the choice to go either place?
Yeah, that will be when he comes back. We're going down to Egypt now.
Oh, okay.
That'll be when he comes back from Egypt.
Okay.
We'll get there in just a minute.
Okay.
You're just a little bit ahead of
I'm
us.
sorry.
So this point, this lookout point, this Shechem place, let's see if I can get it up here. Here's Shechem, what's left of it today. I think it's Nablus is the city today that they call it, but some of this is kind of excavated from the old times. That's a real lookout point. It's kind of like going down Chattanooga, Lookout Mountain, you can see like 7 or 8 states or whatever. This is kind of like that. So he really had a view. When he got down there and he stopped between Bethel and Ai at Shechem, he could see the whole land of Canaan. He could literally see what he had been promised by God. He said, there it is. That's the land I'm getting. That would be pretty incredible, I think. And so in 20, I'll say that for a little bit. He goes on down to Egypt, and then we got this story about this is where his faith is not so strong. He starts getting the willies about, oh, they're going to kill me and take my wife, Sarah, right? So he passes her off as his sister. And this will happen again with Abimelech in chapter 20 and chapter 26. So, you got to wonder about his character, Sarah's character. She goes along with it. And he winds up prospering. He comes out pretty rich when Pharaoh realizes what's going on and sends him packing back to Canaan. Also, in Shechem here, he was by the oak of Moreh. Moreh is a word that means teacher. So it's thought that this was probably a site of Canaanite worship, probably where people assembled together to be taught about the various Canaanite gods and so forth. So we see Abraham doing two things. One, he's obedient, and two, he worships. He builds his own altar. He doesn't worship at their Canaanite altar. He builds his own altar to Yahweh. And then he's promised seed, descendants, and land. You don't need land if you don't have any descendants. If you have a lot of descendants, you need a place to live, right? So seed and land are the two things that he's promised. He keeps going south into the Negev, which is basically the desert region. This is now chapter 13 in the southern part of Canaan, or the land of Israel, as we call it today. And in verse 13, chapter 13, verse 17, God tells him to walk about the land. It's kind of interesting. That was actually a legal ritual for whenever they acquired land, they would walk around the perimeter of the land. 5 minutes. goodness. In order to claim possession of it. So what God is kind of telling me is that this is your land. You know, you're going to walk around it. You're going to be the possessor of this land. Okay, so here's chapter 12. So we see Abram going down to Egypt because of famine. Now remember, this time God hasn't told him to go there. He told him to go to Canaan. He didn't tell him to go to Egypt. This is Abram working on his own. And it doesn't work out too well. So there's a Pharaoh there that we don't know who it is. They become well off while they're down there. He comes back with a lot of stuff. There are some plagues involved. And they depart, like I said, with a lot of stuff. So you can see parallels there between this and what will happen in Exodus with the real Exodus when they actually leave Egypt as slaves. So Abraham and Lot, they both come back. It doesn't actually say that Lot's with them there, but it does say that Lot comes back with them. So I think we can assume that Lot was there too. And then as they come back, they've got so much stuff that they can't stay together. The land won't support them. And this is what Charlie brought up earlier. So Abram's very magnanimous here. He says, you choose. You know, just look, take what you want. I'll take what's left. And of course, Lot chooses the part down by Sodom. And Abraham takes the rest of the land. He settles in Hebron near the oaks of Mamre. Mamre was a person, as we'll see later. He goes out to fight the kings that came in. And so he was a Hittite. The name Mamre means friendship, peaceful alliance, or powerful relations. Yeah, powerful relations. So interesting story there of how Abram settles around these non-Semite people, and yet they seem to be on good terms. In fact, there's some parallels there between, it shows how ancestral worship was different than the worship later on in Israel, like in the temple period. So very, very non-sectarian here. He's not, doesn't seem to be bothered by the fact that they're Hittites. There's a absence of Baal cult. Baal has not actually even been brought into existence yet. We'll run into him in a few minutes. He was the son of El, the Canaan god. There's a lot of intimacy with God here, unmediated intimacy, and then free worship there, except for there doesn't appear to be any worship in Jerusalem at this point. We're going to run across Melchizedek in a minute, who was a king there, but it doesn't appear to be a site of worship. And then in 14, we have this story about the four kings that come from over around Persia, Iran, Iraq, that area, to fight these 5 kings down around the Dead Sea. And they rout them and they take their plunder. And in doing so, they take Lot with them all the way back to the north. And then Abram has to get his buddies, Mamre, Eshcol, the other one, and they go and capture Lot and bring him back. And on the way back, I'm really going fast here. Oh, these are the tar pits. This is what got him in trouble with the battle. That some of them get stuck in these tar pits over there. On the way back, of course, Abram gets blessed by this guy named Melchizedek, who was the king of Salem. Salem is the same as Jerusalem. And it's interesting here, Melchizedek, Melech in Hebrew is king. The Melchizedek part is righteous, so he's a righteous king. But he's not a worshiper of Yahweh. But Abraham winds up tithing to him. He blesses Abraham. And of course, we have a lot about this in Hebrews, about how he's an example or a pattern of the covenant to us.
So Melchizedek did not worship Yahweh?
No, he worshipped this god. He worshipped El. El was a Canaanite god. Later, the Hebrews adopted the name El for Yahweh, for the Hebrew God. But at this point, this is El Elyon, the Canaanite god, and Elyon just was the district that he was God over. In the text.
thought he was, I thought he was a high priest of,
He was a high priest.
Yahweh.
Hebrews.
He's
No.
not?
He was the high priest of this god, the Canaanite god El.
Is that what God knows how?
Yeah, the Elyon. And see, it's confusing because Abraham, just a few verses later, takes that same thing and applies it to Yahweh. So Abraham is basically saying, no, it's really the God of Israel that is the God Most High. It's not your El God over there. It's the real God, the one God. El was one of many gods in Canaan. So he was just one. I'm not sure if this is in the text or not. This is a lot of stuff I read just in preparing for this. But he does say, blessed by Abram, blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. He's referring there to their Canaanite God, not to Yahweh.
It's interesting that Melchizedek brought out bread
And wine. Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
Lord's
And we're
Supper
still doing it
already.
today, right? Still doing the bread and wine thing today. Okay, chapter 15. How are we doing on time? It's got to be close to time. It's time. All right, we'll stop there, I guess, and pick up. We got almost through chapter 15. I only have 3 slides left, so we made up a lot of ground.